Now it's time to move away from the consumer side and think about firm side, the producers. Firms will respond to different prices with different levels of output. And we use this response function. We have a name for it called the supply curve. And we say that the supply curve tells us how much output firms are willing to sell at different possible prices. So, going back to the notation we had before, that would be like saying the quantity supplied is some function h of price. Last time we used f because that was the demand curve. We have a different functional operator now. We don't really care what it is. It's just some formula that will convert prices into how much firms would actually be willing to sell of this particular product. And of course, what we want to do is think about what that looks like graphically. So we'll put quantity on the horizontal axis as usual. We'll put price on the vertical axis, measured as dollars and cents. And that supply curve looks something like this. It's upward sloping. That's the key intuition. It's upward sloping, which means that as you offer firms higher prices, they're going to be willing to sell you more and more of their product. If you offer firms lower prices, for example, I'm here if the price were down here, firms don't want to sell too much. If the price were up here, firms would be willing to sell a lot more. That's the fundamental intuition here, that price and quantity are positively related. Higher prices means you can expect higher quantity from the firms. Now, intuitively, that makes sense. As we go farther down this course, we're going to have to figure out exactly what causes that shape. We're going to have to figure out exactly why that's upward sloping. It's okay to think about it intuitively, but if we're going to understand how firms behave, and if we're going to understand how markets take collections of firms and produce prices, our friendly rationing devices, we're really going to need to understand a lot more about how that supply curve is constructed, and we'll do that as we move down the course. Just as we did when we talked about demand, we're going to introduce some jargon. And here we're going to say that a shift in supply is known as a change in supply. That's the jargon we'll use. On the other hand, a movement along a given supply curve is known as a change in quantity supplied. Exactly as we learned when we talked about the demand curve. This jargon is so that we know when we're talking to each other whether we're talking about the supply curve itself moving or if the supply curve is stationary and you're moving along it. So if you were to say, oh, I expect that drought will cause a reduction in supply, I know that you're exactly correct. The supply of, say, some agricultural product, the whole curve will shift back if there's some drought that lowers the productive capability of the producers. On the other hand, if there's a change in price, suppose price goes up, I don't want to have you think that that means, oh, that's an increase in supply. No. Changes in price would be a movement along a stationary supply curve. So higher prices would cause an increase in quantity supply. Let's take a look at how that works very briefly. And so we'll draw our axis system. And on this system, we have quantity on the horizontal axis, price on the vertical axis, and we have some original supply curve, which looks like that. Again, it's probably not linear. It's probably got some curvature to it. But, you know, linearity gets us all of the intuition we need with a lot more tractability, so we'll just sort of go with the flow in this case. And what we're saying is that if you were to have a change in price for this product, there would be a change in quantity supplied moving along this curve because this curve was constructed to show how much quantity that the firm is willing to sell vary for different possible prices. Now, on the other hand, if some event came along, like we said, suppose this was the quantity of corn, and this was the original supply curve, and then I told you that the Midwest had a disastrous drought over the course of that year. Well, you would know that that would be a reduction in supply, a change in the supply curve. At any possible quoted price, there's just less available than there used to be. So if you were to call out some price, let's pick one out, P0, in the old days, firms would have sold you this amount, but they just don't have that available anymore. In fact, at any possible price that happens, there's just less corn out there than there used to be. And so the supply curve itself has shifted back, and you describe that as saying a reduction in supply, a decrease in supply. Finally, we have one last curve that we want to think about here, and that is we want to think about the same concept we did with demand, and that is to think about market supply. When you quote a price, there are different firms out there. Some firms will supply a certain amount, quantity supplied. Some firms will put a different amount out. Some firms will put a greater amount or less out. But what we do is we aggregate out all of those amounts for that possible price, and that'll give us market supply. Raise the price, and we again get different responses by different firms. And we add all those up, and we're seeing at a higher price, there's actually going to be more coming from the aggregation of all of these firms. So the way to think about that is to think about the fact that there's just a whole bunch of supply curves. This is for firm 1, this would be for firm 2, this would be for firm 3, and there's just a lot of firms out there. Each face prices, each are putting different amounts out there, and they have their own little supply curve. Some of them are not very good, some of them are very strong, some of them look like this. And what we want to do for the market supply is simply add each of these up, and the result will be the market supply curve.